The wind howled across the jagged cliffs of northern Scotland, carrying with it the icy tang of the North Sea, as the old castle perched precariously at the edge of the rocks. Its grey stone walls, worn by centuries of storms, seemed almost alive, whispering secrets in the gusts that rattled the windows. Inside, a palpable tension hung over the grand hall, where servants whispered in hushed tones and guests cast uneasy glances at one another. The silence had been shattered only hours earlier by a discovery that defied reason. Lady Morven MacAllister, the matriarch of the family, was dead, her body found sprawled across the polished marble floor of the library. Nothing had been stolen, and no sign of forced entry marred the heavy oak doors. What made the crime especially confounding was the presence of a single peculiar clue, a small, intricately carved chess piece, a white knight, placed with deliberate care atop the mantel above the fireplace. There was no note, no message, only the silent presence of the piece, as if it had been left to speak for itself. The family had tried to make sense of it, but its meaning eluded them completely. It was too precise to be random, yet too enigmatic to suggest anything straightforward. Every theory seemed either too obvious or entirely impossible. The castle, with its labyrinthine corridors and shadowed corners, seemed almost complicit in the mystery. The library where Lady Morven had been found was locked from the inside, the key still resting in the brass lock. Windows were fastened tightly, and no secret passage had been discovered, despite the servants' repeated insistence that the old fortress was full of hidden tunnels. Whoever had committed the crime had managed to bypass every barrier, leaving behind no trace other than the silent, mocking night. Rumors of ancient curses and family vendettas spread quickly among the household, but each tale only deepened the confusion rather than clarifying it. By the time news of the murder reached him, Hercule Poirot had already begun to assemble the pieces in his meticulous mind. Known for his unerring attention to the smallest detail and his keen understanding of human nature, he travelled swiftly to the remote castle. Upon arrival, he was greeted by the anxious faces of the family and the cautious whispers of the staff, each carrying the weight of fear and suspicion. Poirot's eyes, sharp and calculating, swept over the scene with clinical precision. He observed the angles of the furniture, the placement of the books, the faint smudge on a pane of glass, and the subtle indentation in the rug beneath the fireplace. It was immediately clear to him that this crime had been staged to perplex, almost as if the perpetrator took a perverse pleasure in creating a puzzle. The White Knight, with its deliberate placement, was a challenge, a message encoded in the language of subtlety and misdirection. And yet, beneath the theatricality, Poirot sensed an order, a pattern that would reveal itself to one with patience and insight. He began to interview the household quietly, noting inconsistencies in their statements, the fleeting looks exchanged, the nervous gestures that betrayed more than words could convey. Each response, each hesitation, became a clue in its own right, feeding the intricate web of deduction that Poirot wove around the silent figure of Lady Morven, who now lay at the centre of an enigma no one else could hope to unravel. The longer Poirot lingered, the more the castle itself seemed to breathe around him, the walls steeped in history and secrets, the corridors echoing with silent witnesses to acts long past. Outside, the Scottish wind continued its relentless assault, as if nature itself conspired to heighten the tension. In that storm-lashed fortress, with a crime that defied conventional logic and a solitary white knight mocking all attempts at understanding, Poirot felt the familiar thrill of a challenge worthy of his intellect. The unsolvable crime was, in truth, only seemingly impenetrable. Behind the mask of chaos and confusion, the truth waited patiently, ready to be coaxed into the light by the little grey cells that never rested, even in the most remote and forbidding corners of the world. Poirot moved deliberately through the castle, his small, precise steps echoing softly against the flagstone floors, while the local constable busied himself with formalities, taking notes, measuring distances, questioning servants in a rigid procedural manner. Poirot's gaze swept the room with a quiet intensity that unsettled those around him. He crouched near the library's hearth, inspecting the rug beneath the marble mantel, noting a faint scuff mark that seemed almost imperceptible to anyone less attentive. "Ah, mais oui," he murmured under his breath, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. It was an inconspicuous detail, a trivial imperfection that no official would consider significant, yet to Poirot it suggested a subtle movement, a disturbance deliberately concealed. He straightened, his eyes now drawn to the collection of books arranged with meticulous care on the shelves. One tome, a volume of Scottish history, leaned slightly forward, as if nudged in haste. Poirot's fingers traced the edges, and he detected a faint smudge of dust displaced along the spine. To most, this would seem nothing more than a minor irregularity, yet Poirot understood it as evidence of human presence at a precise moment, an interruption in an otherwise unbroken order. He turned toward the fireplace again, studying the white night that had first caught his attention. Its polished surface reflected the flickering lamplight, but it was not its craftsmanship that intrigued him, rather the subtle angle at which it faced the library door, a silent gesture of orientation that hinted at intention. The detective's eyes then fell upon the servants and family members who hovered near the periphery, their expressions a mixture of grief and apprehension. One of the maids, a young woman with nervous hands, fidgeted with the cuff of her uniform, avoiding direct eye contact. Poirot observed the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw as she answered the constable's questions. A small detail, a twitch, a hesitation, yet it spoke volumes to him. Human behavior, he knew, could betray the truth in ways no physical evidence ever could. Poirot stepped into the corridor leading away from the library, his eyes scanning for anything that seemed out of place. A vase, normally centered on a side table, was shifted slightly, its shadow stretching unnaturally along the wall. A painting depicting a long-forgotten ancestor hung at a tilt that suggested recent interference. These were trifles, trivialities that might escape the notice of anyone else, but to Poirot they were threads waiting to be unraveled into a coherent tapestry. He noted each one meticulously, filing them away in his mind with the precision of a master craftsman. Returning to the hearth, Poirot examined a discarded handkerchief near the body's resting place. Its edges were frayed, and a faint trace of perfume lingered, an aroma unusual in the castle, one that did not belong to Lady Morven nor to any of the known residents. He inhaled delicately, cataloguing the scent, recognizing it as a potential signature of the intruder, a clue overlooked by those who relied solely on observation without thought. Simultaneously, the detective's attention caught a subtle reflection in the glass of the library windows, a fleeting shadow crossing the outer courtyard at a precise moment, suggesting that the perpetrator had entered or exited under cover of distraction. As he surveyed the room again, Poirot's mind began to knit the disparate observations into tentative patterns. Each small inconsistency, each minor irregularity, seemed to him less a coincidence than a deliberate orchestration. The family's outward composure, the servants' quiet murmurs, even the manner in which furniture had been disturbed, all hinted at carefully concealed truths. Though the full picture remained obscured, the first hints of deception were already emerging, like the faint outlines of a map beneath layers of mist. Poirot's small eyes gleamed with the promise of insight. He knew that, in time, the seemingly random details would coalesce into a revelation that would confound those who believed the crime unsolvable. In the silent, wind-lashed castle, he moved quietly, observing, deducing, and waiting, the master detective already tracing the faint invisible lines that would lead to the heart of the mystery. Poirot called the household together in the drawing-room, a vast chamber lined with tapestries depicting generations of stern ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow every movement. He spoke quietly, almost gently, but with an authority that left no room for evasion. One by one, the witnesses, Family members, servants, even a visiting relative offered their accounts of the day's events. Each statement, at first glance, seemed straightforward, but Poirot's practiced ear detected the subtle dissonances that betrayed deeper truths. Lady Morven's nephew, a young man with restless hands and a forced smile, insisted he had been in the billiard room practicing alone when the tragedy occurred. Yet Poirot noted a faint smudge of dust on his polished shoes, the exact type found only in the library, suggesting he had been there more recently than he claimed. When pressed gently about the castle staff's movements, he hesitated, glanced briefly at the maid Poirot had observed earlier, and offered a vague response that almost contradicted his earlier statement. "It is remarkable," Poirot murmured under his breath, "how the truth struggles to hide itself." The maid, pale and trembling, provided her version next. She claimed to have been tending to the castle's laundry in the upper wing all morning, never leaving the corridors. Yet her hands bore faint traces of ink, the same dark, smudgy residue found on the library blotter, a detail unnoticed by all but the detective. Her eyes darted toward a distant corner of the room whenever Poirot asked about the library door, and a small involuntary shiver ran down her spine. There was fear there, yes, but Poirot sensed it was not entirely for Lady Morven. It was a fear of being caught in something she wished to conceal. Even the housekeeper, who prided herself on stern honesty, offered statements that clashed in subtle ways with those of the servants. She spoke of hearing a muffled noise from the library around mid-afternoon, but another servant claimed the room had been completely silent at that time. Poirot listened, not interrupting, letting the contradictions surface naturally. The detective's eyes glimmered as he catalogued every detail. The timing of footsteps, the placement of trays, the very tone of hesitation in each voice. A distant cousin, visiting from Edinburgh, appeared unusually eager to assist, volunteering information even before being asked. He described events with a kind of vividness that seemed rehearsed, too polished, too precise. Poirot's small fingers tapped together, a gesture that betrayed both curiosity and mild amusement. "Ah, the eagerness to please can often betray the cleverest of liars," he said softly to himself. Every over-eagerness, every attempt to dominate the conversation, became in Poirot's mind a signpost toward hidden motives. Poirot observed not only words but silences, the pregnant pauses that fell between them like shadows. One servant, ordinarily reserved, glanced quickly at a coat hung by the fireplace, his eyes narrowing for the briefest moment before continuing with a carefully neutral tone. Another guest, who seemed entirely indifferent at first, subtly avoided discussing the white knight on the mantel, diverting attention with forced commentary on the storm outside. It was in these tiny evasions, the minor hesitations, and the incongruities between speech and gesture that Poirot saw the first outlines of the invisible threads connecting motive, opportunity, and deception. As the session drew to a close, Poirot remained seated, his small frame hunched slightly forward, eyes sweeping over the gathered group. Each statement, each contradiction, had been noted, filed, and quietly analyzed. He could feel the tension in the room, a mixture of guilt, fear, and uncertainty, weaving itself around the witnesses like a tangible shroud. Though nothing had yet been revealed in its entirety, the first impressions of the hidden dynamics were clear. Alliances, resentments, and unspoken intentions danced behind polite words and carefully measured glances. Poirot understood that to solve the puzzle he would need to untangle not only the facts of the murder, but the labyrinth of human deceit that surrounded it, and already the faintest glimmer of a pattern began to emerge from the shadows, pointing towards secrets yet to be unearthed. Poirot spent the following hours in quiet reflection, seated in the drawing-room, sipping a precisely measured cup of tea, while his mind sifted through the tangled web of statements, silences, and fleeting gestures he had observed. Each witness, each family member, presented a layer of possible motive, and yet none offered a straightforward path to the truth. Greed lingered like a shadow behind the nephew's eager expressions. His inheritance was considerable, and Lady Morven's death conveniently accelerated the transfer of wealth, but greed alone could not account for the meticulous staging, the locked library, or the deliberately placed white knight. There had to be more, something subtler, something personal. Jealousy, too, whispered from the corners of the castle. The housekeeper's eyes, sharp and calculating, had occasionally glimmered with resentment, a quiet disapproval of Lady Morven's strict management of the household and the favour shown to certain servants over others. Even the young maid carried traces of envy in her nervous fidgeting, as though the matriarch's authority overshadowed her ambitions, yet her fear suggested she knew far more than she admitted. Poirot noted these undercurrents carefully, knowing that emotions, when entwined with opportunity, often became catalysts for deeds otherwise unimaginable. Revenge lurked beneath the surface as well, though it was hidden under layers of civility. The distant cousin from Edinburgh, outwardly helpful and polished, carried an air of quiet indignation. Poirot recalled a brief exchange in which the man had referenced a dispute over family property years before, a minor quarrel that, if inflamed by time and pride, could have grown into something lethal. Even the servants had their grievances, subtle slights and perceived injustices that could, in the right or wrong circumstances, ignite into acts of violence. The detective's mind mapped these connections, tracing lines from perceived injuries to possible motivations, linking them carefully to movements and opportunities observed in the hours before Lady Morven's death. Poirot also considered fear, the hidden motive that often shapes behavior more effectively than greed or malice. Several witnesses had displayed nervousness beyond what simple shock could explain. The young maid's trembling hands, the timid avoidance of eye contact, the hushed tone in which she reported her actions, all suggested someone who feared discovery. Perhaps she had been coerced or complicit, knowingly or not, in a scheme designed to mislead. Fear, Poirot knew, could bind people together in silence or drive them to subtle acts of sabotage, even if they never intended direct violence. Slowly, he began cross-referencing alibis with the small inconsistencies he had noted. The nephew's claim of practicing alone did not match the faint dust on his shoes. The housekeeper's story conflicted with the servant who claimed no noise had been heard in the library. The maid's presence in the upper wing seemed contradicted by the ink traces on her hands. Each small discrepancy suggested movement, presence, or intervention that the witness had attempted to conceal. Poirot's little grey cells worked with patient rigour, spinning each thread of possibility into a larger tapestry of intent and action. By evening, the detective had begun to see outlines forming amid the chaos. No single motive could explain the crime fully. The truth lay in the intersection of multiple desires, fears, and grudges, each shaping behaviour in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Lady Morven's death was not the result of a simple impulse or an obvious grievance. It was a confluence of human complexities, orchestrated with cunning precision. The locked library, the white knight, the minor disturbances, and the contradictory statements all fit into a pattern that promised to reveal itself with patience, observation, and careful deduction. Poirot leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing, a faint smile playing on his lips. The maze of motives was intricate, tangled, yet he could feel the threads beginning to lead him toward a singular, coherent explanation, one that would expose the unseen hands guiding every deception within the ancient stone walls of the castle. Late in the evening, as the storm outside eased into a persistent drizzle, a seemingly decisive clue came to light. A gloved hand, left behind near the library's side door, bore faint traces of a dark substance that matched the ink smudge found earlier on the young maid's hands. The local constable, eager to demonstrate progress, seized upon this as the breakthrough he had been waiting for. Statements were compared, confessions subtly coaxed, and within hours the household buzzed with the assertion that the mystery had been solved. The young maid, trembling and overwhelmed, was reluctantly positioned at the centre of the resolution. It seemed, to the authorities, that the puzzle had finally been pieced together. Yet Poirot's keen eyes, small and calculating, remained unconvinced. He studied the scene again, moving deliberately through the library as if each object, each shadow could speak if only examined correctly. The gloved hand could indeed place her in the vicinity, but the larger choreography of events did not align. The White Knight still faced the door, its silent orientation unresolved. The subtle dust disturbances on the rug, the misplaced book, the faint reflection of movement outside the window, all suggested a more intricate sequence of actions than a single frightened maid could have orchestrated. Poirot's lips pressed together, forming a thin contemplative line. Something was missing. The real story lay behind this convenient conclusion, obscured by eagerness and fear. He observed the reactions of the household as the authorities congratulated themselves on their swift deduction. The nephew, outwardly relieved, now displayed a barely perceptible gleam of triumph in his eyes, as if the focus on the maid had subtly shifted suspicion elsewhere. The housekeeper, meanwhile, maintained her stern facade. Yet Poirot detected the slight twitch of her hand, a tension that suggested she too knew more than she had disclosed. Even the distant cousin, now quietly observing from the corner, allowed a faint smile to cross his face as the case was prematurely closed. Each person's response, so easily misread by others, fed Poirot's growing certainty. The real culprit remained unseen, watching and calculating, their motives and actions hidden behind layers of deception. Poirot examined the library once more, crouching to inspect the floor near the fireplace. There a faint scuff mark led toward the window, a mark overlooked in the early flurry of investigation. He followed the subtle trace, noting the precise way in which dust had been displaced. It indicated deliberate movement, a purposeful exit, one that required knowledge of the castle's layout and timing beyond what the young maid could have possessed. The sequence of events, meticulously reconstructed in Poirot's mind, contradicted the apparent simplicity of the authorities' solution. It was not a mistake. It was a false victory, a carefully orchestrated misdirection, and Poirot understood that the true perpetrator was still very much at large. The detective's thoughts turned to the White Knight again. Its placement, previously assumed decorative or symbolic, now seemed an active signal, a marker of control and cunning. The perpetrator had not only committed the crime, but had manipulated the investigation, planting evidence and guiding attention toward a convenient scapegoat. To Poirot, the deception was audacious in its precision, requiring patience, foresight, and a deep understanding of human psychology. As he straightened, the flickering lamplight catching in his sharp eyes, he realized that the storm outside mirrored the storm within the castle, calm on the surface, yet charged with hidden, relentless energy. While the household settled into an uneasy relief, Poirot remained alert, attuned to the faintest tremor of contradiction, the slightest gesture that betrayed hidden intent. The early triumph of the authorities did not satisfy him. The threads of deception were still weaving, and the real criminal, confident in their anonymity, waited for the perfect moment to strike again, or perhaps to leave a final, unmistakable signature. Poirot's mind, ever vigilant, traced the invisible contours of this silent challenge, ready to illuminate the truth when the moment arrived, certain that the apparent solution was nothing more than an elegant illusion. As the household settled into uneasy quiet, Poirot lingered in the library, studying the White Knight once more. Its silent, polished presence seemed almost to mock the attempts at resolution so far. He reached for a leather-bound ledger tucked behind the row of history books, a volume cataloguing the castle's past visitors and incidents, maintained meticulously by generations of housekeepers. Flipping through the pages, his sharp eyes paused on an entry from nearly 2 decades prior, a minor scandal involving a stolen family heirloom and a confrontation between Lady Morven and a distant cousin's spouse, whose name now resurfaced among the current visitors. The details were innocuous at first glance, an accusation, a dispute over property, and a quiet departure. But Poirot sensed a lingering bitterness, the kind that grows imperceptibly over years and waits for the right moment to surface. He traced the connections further, cross-referencing faces and relationships with statements given earlier. The young maid, seemingly peripheral and fearful, had been employed at the castle for only a short period, yet her family ties, revealed in passing conversation, linked her to the very cousin involved in the old dispute. The implications were subtle but undeniable. Someone had orchestrated a convergence of past grievances and present opportunities, weaving old resentment into the fabric of the current tragedy. Poirot leaned back, steepling his fingers, noting the elegance with which history had been exploited to mask intent. Examining the room, he recalled the faint scuff marks on the rug, the displaced book, and the reflections from the windows. Each minor disturbance could now be reinterpreted in light of the past, the timing of movements, the calculated placement of objects, even the choice of the white knight as a symbol. All seemed deliberate, almost ceremonial, echoing a story from long ago. The chess piece, Poirot realized, was not random. It referenced a past confrontation, a subtle message understood only by those who knew the full history of the family's disputes. In that realization, the crime became more than an isolated act of violence. It was a continuation, a calculated chapter in a saga of slights, betrayals, and grudges. Poirot requested the presence of the cousin, who had been quietly observing earlier. When questioned, the man's demeanor shifted slightly, a hint of defensiveness betraying his outward composure. Poirot spoke gently but deliberately, tracing lines from the past to the present, revealing connections invisible to anyone untrained in subtle observation. He noted the cousin's hesitation when asked about specific interactions years ago, the subtle inflection of voice, and the fleeting glance toward the maid. The detective could see the concealed hierarchy of influence and resentment that had guided choices, shaping behavior without outward declaration. Even the housekeeper, whose knowledge of the castle's history had seemed merely practical, now revealed an unintended clue. She mentioned a particular guest who had been present during the previous dispute, a detail forgotten until Poirot drew it out. That connection, combined with the nephew's proximity to inherited wealth and the maid's familial ties, painted a network of intertwined motives reaching back years. The murder was not merely a product of immediate desires. It had been seeded long ago, nurtured by grudges and unresolved tensions, now erupting in violence with meticulous precision. Poirot returned to the white knight, turning it slowly in his hand. Its placement, its orientation, and its symbolic value were no accident. The past had guided the present, orchestrating a scene designed to mislead, manipulate, and intimidate. Every detail he had noted, the subtle dust marks, the smudged ink, the faint reflection, the nervous gestures, now coalesced around this hidden narrative, a story that intertwined history, human frailty, and cunning calculation. The detective's small eyes gleamed as the fog of confusion began to lift. The crime was no longer an isolated event of chance or impulse. It was a tapestry of old resentments, strategic maneuvers, and concealed relationships, waiting to be unraveled to reveal the hand that had orchestrated it all. Poirot sat quietly in the drawing-room, the storm outside having dwindled to a soft patter against the castle windows. He did not speak, yet his eyes, sharp and unwavering, scanned the assembled household. The detective had spent hours retracing steps, connecting past grievances to present opportunities, and cataloguing every micro-expression and inconsistency. But he knew that to draw out the truth, he would need something beyond observation, an unconventional tactic, one that tested character rather than relied solely on physical evidence. He called the nephew forward, inviting him to sit in the chair near the fireplace. Poirot placed the white knight gently on the low table between them. "Monsieur," he said, his tone light yet deliberate, "you understand the importance of symbols, n'est-ce pas? This piece, it represents a strategy in a game, the sacrifice of one to gain the victory of another. Perhaps, in this situation, one can learn more from intentions than from words." The nephew's eyes flickered momentarily to the chess piece, then back to Poirot, a faint tension sharpening his features. Poirot's approach was subtle. He did not accuse. Instead, he proposed a small exercise, framed as a matter of curiosity. "Imagine, if you will, that the chessboard is life itself," he said, gesturing slightly toward the piece. "Every move is observed, every action has consequences. Tell me, in such a game, would one act from impulse, from fear, or from long-planned intention?" He allowed the question to hang in the air, his expression calm, almost inviting. The nephew's response was careful, practiced, yet something about the hesitation betrayed him. He spoke of strategy and caution, of moves made for advantage rather than for immediate reaction, but his eyes flickered to the white knight again, betraying a subconscious recognition. Poirot leaned forward slightly, a gentle smile curving his lips. "Ah, mais oui," he murmured softly, noting the subtle tightening of the nephew's hands. The young man had tried to maintain composure, yet the question had nudged an instinctive reaction, a crack in the facade of careful control. Next, Poirot invited the distant cousin to join, casually weaving references to the old dispute into conversation, presenting them as philosophical hypotheticals rather than pointed inquiries. The cousin's manner remained outwardly polite, yet when asked to speculate on the outcome of a hypothetical betrayal, his gaze shifted imperceptibly toward the maid. It was a fleeting glance, unnoticed by all except the detective, but it revealed a connection, an implicit acknowledgement of past entanglements and current strategy. Poirot's little grey cells registered it immediately. The cousin's subtle discomfort suggested that the past was not only remembered, but actively influencing present actions. Finally, Poirot turned his attention to the maid. Instead of pressing for confession, he presented a small, seemingly trivial test. He placed a tiny vial of scent on the table, one similar to the fragrance faintly detected on her hands earlier, and casually asked whether she recognized it. The maid's reaction was instantaneous, a sharp intake of breath, a quick glance toward the door, a tremor in her fingers. Though she quickly attempted to recover, Poirot observed the slight flush rising to her cheeks and the involuntary step backward. It was an honest, unguarded reaction, fear and recognition intermingled, revealing a level of involvement that words alone had not. As the detective sat back, his small eyes gleaming, he allowed the silence to settle over the room. The unconventional tactics had done their work. The suspect's responses, unprompted by direct accusation, had illuminated hidden truths. The cracks in their deception, subtle and fleeting, now provided Poirot with a clearer path through the labyrinth of motives, old grievances, and carefully constructed lies. The stage was set, the players revealed not by what they said, but by what they could not fully conceal, and the final moves of the intricate puzzle were beginning to fall into place under the detective's precise, unerring gaze. The morning light filtered weakly through the heavy drapes, casting a muted glow over the castle's grand corridors. Poirot had barely begun reviewing the notes and observations gathered from the previous evening when an urgent commotion drew him toward the library. The constable, breathless and flustered, met him at the door. "Monsieur Poirot," he stammered, "the ledger, it's gone. The ledger with the records of past incidents and visitors, it's missing." Poirot's small eyes narrowed as he stepped inside. The shelf where he had found the century-old ledger was now empty, the leather-bound volume absent, leaving behind only a faint outline in the dust where it had rested. The meticulous record of prior grievances, disputes, and movements, so crucial to understanding the connections between suspects, had vanished. The disappearance was deliberate, he realized immediately. Someone had recognized its significance and sought to erase the trail that might expose them. He scanned the library with careful precision, noting the absence of any signs of forced entry. No broken lock, no smashed window, no disturbance beyond the missing ledger itself. The theft had been calculated, executed by someone with intimate knowledge of the castle's layout and of the evidence's value. Poirot felt the familiar thrill of the chase mingle with the tension of urgency. Whoever had taken it was clever, but not clever enough to escape the keen observation of a trained mind. He turned to the household, who now gathered nervously, faces pale with shock. The maid, the nephew, the cousin, and the housekeeper all exchanged glances, uncertain how to respond. Poirot's gaze swept over them slowly, noting subtle reactions. The cousin's hand twitched almost imperceptibly, the housekeeper's lips pressed together tightly, and the young maid avoided his direct stare. These minor gestures, easily overlooked by others, spoke volumes to the detective. He understood instinctively that the vanishing ledger was not an isolated act. It was part of a larger strategy designed to misdirect and intimidate. Poirot moved to the fireplace, kneeling to inspect the area where the ledger had rested. The dust was undisturbed except for a narrow smudge near the base, suggesting the volume had been lifted with care and then carried directly toward the exit. The absence of footprints indicated the thief had worn gloves, a precaution that signaled both intent and familiarity with the stakes involved. His mind raced, considering who could have orchestrated such a precise maneuver without drawing attention, and how the timing correlated with his recent questioning of the household. Turning to the gathered witnesses, Poirot addressed them in a voice that was calm yet unyielding. "Mes amis, the ledger is gone, and with it a fragment of the truth. But let us not be deceived. The hand that removed it has revealed itself through subtle signs. One cannot erase the past entirely. Even in absence it speaks." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. The tension in the room was palpable, each person acutely aware that the theft had raised the stakes. Trust, always fragile in a household rife with hidden motives, now became even more precarious. Poirot's mind began reconstructing the timeline, imagining the movement of the thief and the possible destinations of the ledger. Every glance, every hesitation observed in the previous sessions, now took on new meaning. The disappearance was a message as well as an obstruction. Someone was attempting to control the investigation, to manipulate perception, and to conceal the true path to Lady Morven's murderer. The detective's small eyes glimmered with determination. The vanishing evidence had not thwarted him. It had only illuminated the audacity and intelligence of the criminal, underscoring the urgency and the precision with which he would need to act to unmask the perpetrator. By late afternoon, a heavy silence had settled over the castle, the storm from the previous night replaced by a low, grey drizzle that coated the cliffs in mist. Poirot had been retracing his mental map of events, piecing together movements, motives, and subtle clues, when a sudden scream shattered the fragile calm. He rushed toward the source, the servants' quarters, and found a small group gathered outside a locked door, their faces pale and anxious. The constable fumbled with the key, revealing a scene that made Poirot's heart tighten. The distant cousin lay unconscious on the floor, a deep gash across his temple, and beside him a hastily scrawled note smeared in ink. Poirot knelt beside the victim, his eyes scanning for immediate signs of life and threat. The injury, though serious, was not yet fatal, but the attack's suddenness and precision left little doubt in his mind. The perpetrator was still active, still orchestrating events with deliberate cunning. The note, hastily written yet unmistakable in its purpose, was a taunt, a reminder that the criminal had not only anticipated the investigation, but had the audacity to challenge it directly. Every instinct of the detective's mind screamed that this was no random act of violence. It was a calculated message, an escalation intended to intimidate and mislead. The household erupted into murmurs of fear and speculation, but Poirot remained focused, his gaze sweeping the room and noting minute details overlooked by others. A chair slightly askew, a fragment of broken glass near the window, and a faint trace of perfume clinging to the air. All suggested the intruder had been inside moments earlier, moving with the same careful precision observed in the theft of the ledger. Poirot's small eyes narrowed as he considered the timing. The attack could not have been spontaneous. It had been planned, synchronized with the household's distractions, and timed to exploit vulnerabilities. He instructed the staff to secure the area while he examined the note. The writing was erratic, as though hurried, but contained subtle stylistic flourishes that revealed much about the author's temperament. Poirot traced the lines of ink with a delicate finger, noting the pressure and hesitation at certain points, signs of both intelligence and restraint, someone capable of calculated violence but unwilling to act without purpose. The choice of victim was equally revealing. The cousin, tied to past disputes and currently under scrutiny, had been a convenient target to misdirect attention from the true perpetrator. Poirot turned to the young maid and the nephew, his sharp gaze pausing on each, measuring their reactions. Both flinched, though in different ways. The maid's fear deepened, an instinctive acknowledgement of danger, while the nephew's composure wavered, revealing the tiniest flicker of anticipation, almost satisfaction, that the investigation had been complicated further. These responses were fleeting, subtle, but to Poirot they were like windows into the psyche of those entwined in the crime's intricate web. He stepped into the corridor, retracing potential paths of entry and exit. The broken glass suggested a minor point of forced access, yet other details, the lack of footprints, the careful displacement of objects, confirmed that the intruder possessed both knowledge and skill. Poirot's mind raced, recalculating the sequence of events, weighing each possibility against previous observations, and considering the implications of this brazen escalation. The criminal had proven capable not only of theft and manipulation but of direct, violent interference, and now the detective faced the pressing task of preventing further harm. As the household absorbed the shock, Poirot remained calm, yet internally alert, sensing the delicate balance between fear and opportunity. The villain had shifted from hiding in shadows to striking overtly, testing both courage and intellect. Poirot's mind, ever methodical, began charting countermeasures, anticipating the next move even as the storm within the castle intensified. He understood clearly solving the original murder was no longer sufficient. To protect the innocent and bring the perpetrator to justice, he would need to outthink a criminal several steps ahead, navigating a labyrinth of deceit, history, and danger before another act of violence could unfold. Poirot returned to the library that evening, alone, moving silently through the familiar room as the household remained tense in their respective quarters. He did not need to hurry. The storm of events had slowed for now, but the mind of a detective like him was never at rest. As he examined the scene once again, the tilted book, the faint scuff marks on the rug, the white knight still perched deliberately on the mantel, something subtle caught his attention. A small brass key, half hidden beneath a decorative inkwell, gleamed faintly in the lamplight. At first glance it seemed trivial, almost ornamental, as though it belonged to no lock at all. But Poirot's eyes, sharp and exacting, recognized the significance immediately. He held the key between his fingers, turning it over and noting the faint scratches along its edge, signs of repeated use. It was an object dismissed by others, easily overlooked, yet here it lay in proximity to the first crime scene, the vanished ledger, and the subsequent assault. It suggested not merely access but intention, a deliberate connection to the actions of someone familiar with the castle's private spaces. A pattern began to crystallize in Poirot's mind. The seemingly random disturbances, the theft, the attack on the cousin, they were not isolated acts. Each was a move in a meticulously orchestrated sequence, executed by someone exploiting knowledge of both people and architecture. As he traced the key's possible uses in his memory of the castle, Poirot recalled an offhand comment by the housekeeper days earlier. When asked about the library, many keys have been lost over the years, some open doors that others would never think to check. At the time, he had barely registered the remark, noting only the domestic practicality of her words. Now, it clicked into place. The missing ledger, the precise timing of movements, the access points exploited, all could be explained by the knowledge embedded in those overlooked keys. The intruder had not merely acted, they had anticipated, navigated, and manipulated the castle itself to serve their ends. Poirot's gaze swept the library once more, connecting each object and gesture to this newfound insight. The White Knight's orientation, previously enigmatic, now appeared as a subtle marker, indicating the path through which the key, and by extension the perpetrator, had been utilized. The scuff marks, the misplaced books, even the seemingly insignificant reflections in the windows, all were part of a sequence, a silent choreography that guided the criminal's movements while misleading the household and the authorities. Each clue that had appeared disconnected, confusing, or trivial now fell into line, revealing the deliberate logic underpinning the chaos. He thought of the reactions he had observed, the fleeting glances, the nervous shifts, the faint but telling gestures. They now aligned with the pattern. The young maid's fear, the cousin's subtle discomfort, the nephew's tense composure, all were indicators of proximity to this hidden knowledge, whether through complicity, manipulation, or mere awareness. The criminal had relied not only on physical stealth, but on psychological control, exploiting the natural behaviors and weaknesses of those around them. Poirot leaned back, allowing the realization to settle fully. The investigation had seemed chaotic, the sequence of events unpredictable, yet the key, both literal and metaphorical, had been present all along. The pattern was now clear. Every act, every disturbance, every misdirection was deliberate, guided by intimate knowledge of the castle, its history, and the individuals within it. With this insight, Poirot understood that the final steps to unveiling the culprit would require not only observation but an anticipatory strategy, placing himself one move ahead in a game the criminal believed they had mastered. The solution he knew was at hand, the invisible thread connecting past grievances, present actions, and hidden tools had revealed itself in plain sight, and the climax of the mystery was imminent. Poirot spent the late evening piecing together the final threads, his mind weaving together observations, inconsistencies, and the subtle psychological cues he had collected over the days of the investigation. The castle, quiet now except for the occasional groan of old timbers settling, seemed almost to lean in, as though awaiting the revelation he had long anticipated. He called the household together once more, not with accusation, but with the quiet, deliberate air of a conductor preparing to reveal a symphony's final movement. He began by recounting the events in meticulous detail, the discovery of Lady Morven's body, the peculiar placement of the White Knight, the inconsistencies in alibis, the vanishing ledger, and the assault on the cousin. Each fact, each seemingly isolated anomaly, was traced back to a single coherent chain of action. Poirot's small eyes swept over the assembled faces, noting the subtle shifts, the tightened grips, the involuntary twitches. Then, with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the tension in the room, he addressed the culprit indirectly, allowing the pressure of anticipation to do its work. The crime, mes amis, has been regarded as one of opportunity, greed, envy, revenge. But these are the shadows that hide the true shape of events, he began, his voice smooth, precise, unrelenting. We have looked at the ledger, at the keys, at the placement of objects, but the truth, the deepest truth, is of the heart. It is not always the desire for wealth or the settling of scores that drives a human being to extremes. It is fear of exposure, fear of disgrace, and the compulsive need to control the narrative of one's own life. Poirot paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. The young maid shifted uneasily. The nephew's posture stiffened. The cousin's eyes darted toward the window. The intruder exploited the castle itself, yes, but why? Poirot continued. Because only by manipulating events, by orchestrating fear and confusion, could they shield themselves from a secret long buried, a transgression they could not afford anyone to discover. Every action, the placement of the knight, the theft of the ledger, the attack, was designed to prevent the revelation of this truth. The crime was never merely about inheritance or revenge. It was about preserving a carefully constructed image, a life built on deception, maintained at all costs. He turned his gaze slowly to the housekeeper. The ledger was not just a record of past incidents. It contained evidence that, if seen by the wrong eyes, could expose acts unthinkable, acts of betrayal and manipulation, stretching back years. The pattern of chaos we observed was intended to divert attention, to frame others, to disguise the underlying motive, the desperate need to hide one's own culpability and the fear that a single misstep would unravel everything. The subtle tremor in the housekeeper's hand, the slight flush rising to her cheeks, and the way her eyes flickered toward the maid revealed what Poirot had deduced. The truth was far more personal, more psychological, than any of the household had suspected. The crime was an intricate performance of control, born of a mind willing to manipulate, to threaten, and even to kill in order to protect a carefully maintained self-image. It was the manifestation of fear, pride, and obsession all at once, a motive so hidden, so internalized, that no external incentive could rival its power. Poirot leaned back slightly, his expression one of calm certainty. The veil had lifted. What had appeared as a tangle of greed, jealousy, and revenge was, in fact, a meticulously orchestrated defense against exposure, a psychological labyrinth constructed by a mind both brilliant and dangerously unyielding. The villain's reasoning, so extreme, so compellingly hidden beneath layers of manipulation, explained every movement, every misdirection, every calculated act of terror within the castle walls. The true motive, he realized, was not just shocking. It was the darkest, most intimate revelation of all. The crime had been committed to protect the secrets of the mind itself. Poirot spent the evening quietly preparing his final move, arranging the pieces of the puzzle with the precision of a master strategist. He had reconstructed the chronology of events in his mind, traced every subtle gesture, and now knew exactly where the criminal would act next. The castle, with its labyrinthine corridors, hidden keys and secret alcoves, would itself become part of the trap. He summoned the household to the drawing-room once more, claiming he had uncovered the final clue, and that the perpetrator's next move would reveal itself imminently. The storm outside had returned in muted form, a constant patter against the windows that added tension to the otherwise still air. Poirot's small frame, seated in a high-backed chair, exuded calm control, and the assembled household felt the weight of his presence. He recounted the investigation, deliberately leaving certain threads dangling, allowing the tension to build, and observing each reaction with the meticulous care of a hawk tracking its prey. Subtle glances, nervous fidgets, and the faintest signs of hesitation became the signals that guided his next steps. Finally, he addressed the culprit indirectly, weaving a narrative that implicated the vanishing ledger, the White Knight, and the assault on the cousin, as deliberate parts of a grand design. "It is curious," he said softly, "how someone might believe they can manipulate the mind and actions of all around them, weaving chaos to cover their own truth. Yet even the most careful orchestration leaves traces, subtle but undeniable." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room, small and intense, landing on the housekeeper, who now visibly stiffened. At that moment, the door to the library creaked faintly. Poirot's gaze snapped to the sound, and in a fluid motion he indicated with a subtle gesture for the constable to block the exit. The housekeeper, realizing the trap had been anticipated, hesitated, her carefully maintained composure faltering. Poirot's voice, soft yet commanding, continued, "You see, mes amis, every act of deception, every hidden motive, has left a trail. One cannot erase the past, nor manipulate events without leaving signs. The pattern has emerged, and the truth cannot hide any longer." The housekeeper's eyes darted toward the window, then back at Poirot, her lips parting as though to protest, to deny, yet no words came. A sharp inhale betrayed fear, and her hand instinctively reached toward a small pocket, perhaps to retrieve a hidden item, perhaps to attempt one final act of defiance. Poirot's calm remained unbroken. He had anticipated this. "There is no need for further deception," he said quietly, rising to his feet. "The ledger may have been taken, but the truth is far more enduring, Under the quiet intensity of his gaze, the housekeeper finally faltered. Her shoulders slumped, and she admitted, almost in a whisper, to the theft of the ledger, the assault on the cousin, and the orchestration of chaos that had masked her true intent. The motive, she confessed, had been far more personal than anyone could have imagined, a desperate need to conceal past indiscretions that threatened to ruin her carefully curated reputation and control over the household. Every act, every subtle manipulation had been executed with meticulous care to protect herself, yet each had inadvertently left the trail that Poirot had patiently followed. The constable moved to restrain her, but Poirot waved a hand, ensuring the moment of revelation remained undisturbed. He explained the sequence of events, the use of keys, the manipulation of perception, and the psychological subtleties that had guided the criminal's actions. The housekeeper, now subdued by the unrelenting clarity of the detective's reasoning, acknowledged the brilliance of his deductions. The tension in the room eased, replaced by a profound awareness of the precision and inevitability of justice. Poirot, small and composed, returned the white knight to the mantel, the symbol of the intricate chess game that had unfolded within the castle. The storm outside gradually softened, and in the quiet that followed, the detective allowed himself a faint, satisfied smile. Every piece was in place, every deception laid bare, and the truth, painstakingly uncovered, now shone with the clarity of unassailable logic. The final confrontation had ended not with violence, but with revelation, a testament to the power of observation, deduction, and the inescapable consequences of human choice. The household had begun to relax, the air lightening as the weight of the confrontation lifted. The housekeeper, now under guard, had confessed to the theft of the ledger, the assault on the cousin, and the manipulation of events that had masked her true intentions. The constable moved about, recording statements, and the maid, nephew, and cousin exchanged cautious glances, relieved that the danger seemed contained. Even Poirot allowed himself a brief, satisfied nod, confident that the puzzle had been solved, or so it seemed. But as he lingered in the library, retracing the steps in his mind and examining the scattered papers on the desk, a faint irregularity caught his attention. It was almost imperceptible, a folded corner on a sheet of stationery tucked behind the ledger's resting place previously unnoticed. Poirot's small fingers unfolded it with care. The handwriting was unfamiliar, not that of the housekeeper, not of any of the household he had questioned. It was a note, brief and cryptic, hinting at knowledge far beyond what any ordinary accomplice could possess. His eyes narrowed. The housekeeper had been clever, yes, but someone else had moved behind the scenes, orchestrating her actions and providing guidance, ensuring each misdirection served a larger, hidden purpose. The carefully constructed final confession was real only in part. It had been facilitated, almost choreographed, by a mind more calculating and manipulative than she alone could possess. Poirot felt the familiar thrill of the unexpected twist ripple through him. The case was not closed, not until this unseen hand was revealed. He gathered the household, once more, speaking gently but deliberately. "Mes amis," he began, "we have witnessed the confession of one who acted with cunning and fear. But there remains a detail that cannot be ignored. A subtle signature, a guiding influence, unseen yet precise, has shaped the events we have observed. Someone else has been pulling the strings." The constable stiffened, the maid's eyes widened, and the cousin shifted uneasily, instinctively aware that the revelation did not bode well for appearances. Poirot's gaze fixed on the nephew. The young man's nervous energy, previously interpreted as fear of inheritance, now aligned differently. The folded note, the subtle manipulations, the timing of the ledger's disappearance, and the precision of the attack on the cousin all bore marks of intellect and strategy that suggested a mind more sophisticated than the housekeeper's. Poirot's mind traced each action backward, the careful guidance of the housekeeper, the subtle nudges to misdirect the investigation, the knowledge of hidden keys, and the anticipation of each move in the unfolding drama. The nephew's eagerness, his earlier flickers of satisfaction when the maid was blamed, now revealed a deeper layer. He had orchestrated the events from the shadows, manipulating both fear and evidence with meticulous calculation. The detective allowed the moment to settle, letting the tension rise, then spoke quietly. The housekeeper acted, yes, but she acted under direction. Someone with greater foresight, a keen understanding of human weakness, has engineered the chaos we have witnessed. And that person is you, mon ami. The nephew's face went pale, his composure crumbling as the implications sank in. Every gesture, every deviation, every subtle reaction that Poirot had noted now crystallized into undeniable evidence of his orchestration. A brief struggle ensued as the nephew attempted to escape, but Poirot's calm, deliberate commands ensured the constable was ready. The nephew's attempts at defiance were futile. The game, brilliant though it had been anticipated. Poirot stepped forward, small and composed, his voice steady. You see, the cleverest deception cannot hide from observation, deduction, and the immutable logic of human behavior. In that moment, the household realized that the true mastermind had been hiding in plain sight, that the carefully woven narrative of fear, misdirection, and confession had been only part of a larger plan. The last-minute twist did not diminish the housekeeper's culpability, but it illuminated the greater scope of calculation, the reach of intellect willing to manipulate all around it. Poirot's genius had been tested to its utmost, and yet, as always, he had emerged not just triumphant, but serene, the final truth revealed with inexorable clarity. The castle had grown silent once more, the tension settling into a heavy stillness as the household absorbed the shocking revelation. The nephew, now securely restrained by the constable, sat slumped in the chair, the clever mask of arrogance replaced by the pale sheen of panic. The housekeeper, still under guard, remained quiet, aware that her own manipulations had been overshadowed by the far greater cunning of the young man she had unwittingly served. Poirot moved slowly through the room, small eyes glinting with calm satisfaction, as he prepared to lay bare the full measure of the truth. "Mes amis," he began, his voice soft yet penetrating, "we have observed many threads woven into this tapestry of deceit, theft, assault, misdirection, and concealment. And yet, the crucial understanding, one that eluded even the most vigilant among you, was the hand behind it all. Each seemingly isolated act, each misplaced object, each hesitation and glance, was part of a larger design." He gestured lightly toward the white knight perched on the mantel. The knight, innocuous in appearance, marked more than a spot. It was a signal, a marker for one who knew the history of this house and the vulnerabilities of its inhabitants. He turned to the housekeeper, nodding gently. "You acted out of fear and preservation, yes, but you were not the architect. You were a tool in a game far more intricate than your own ambitions could fully grasp." Her eyes lowered, a mixture of relief and humiliation crossing her features. Poirot's gaze then rested on the nephew, who now attempted no protest. The detective's small fingers tapped lightly against the ledger, recovered from a hidden compartment where the mastermind had stashed it for safekeeping. The ledger was removed, not to erase evidence, but to mislead, to create the illusion of chaos while keeping the true orchestrator safely obscured. Poirot continued, "And who possessed the foresight, the patience, and the understanding of human nature required to manipulate so many moving pieces? You, my young friend. Your careful observations, your subtle cues, and your anticipation of every action allowed you to control outcomes from the shadows." The nephew's head fell into his hands, the weight of exposure finally settling upon him. Poirot walked the room, touching on the clues that had revealed his identity, the subtle flickers of satisfaction when the investigation misled others, the knowledge of hidden keys and secret corridors, the calculated placement of the White Knight, the manipulation of the housekeeper and the maid, even the precise timing of the cousin's assault. Each detail, trivial in isolation, formed a chain of undeniable evidence. "It is the small things," Poirot explained softly, "the overlooked gestures, the offhand comments, the patterns we dismiss that reveal the truth. One cannot hide forever from careful observation." Yet, as the constable moved to formally take the nephew into custody, a flicker of doubt crossed Poirot's mind. The young man's compliance seemed almost too complete. The ease with which he surrendered knowledge contained a subtle hint of confidence, as though he knew the game was not yet fully finished. Poirot glanced toward the window, toward the shadowed corridors of the castle beyond, and a small contemplative smile touched his lips. Justice had been served for now, the immediate threat contained, but he knew that intellect like this, calculating, patient, and ruthless, could never be fully restrained. As the household began to process the events, Poirot addressed them one final time. "Observe, mes amis, how deception may obscure, yet never erase the truth. Every hesitation, every glance, every object placed with care, these are the footprints of the mind. Today, we have seen justice delivered, but let us remember, cleverness may be bound, yet it cannot be destroyed. One must always remain vigilant." The castle settled into uneasy quiet once more. The crime had been solved, the villains exposed, yet the lingering sense of unfinished business, of genius barely restrained, remained like a shadow in the corners of the great halls. Poirot, small, calm, and ever watchful, knew that the intricacies of human cunning could never truly vanish, and in that knowledge he allowed himself a brief, serene satisfaction. Justice had been served for now, and the world had once again yielded to the precise, unerring logic of his little grey cells. The castle had grown quiet once more, the last echoes of hurried footsteps and whispered confessions fading into the shadowed corridors. Poirot lingered in the drawing-room, his small frame leaning slightly against the mantel, eyes fixed upon the white knight, now returned to its proper place. The household had begun to settle, the constable having taken the nephew and secured the housekeeper, yet even in this apparent calm, Poirot's mind remained alert, scanning for the faintest irregularity, the subtle clue others might overlook. He picked up the ledger, flipping through its pages with deliberate care, noting not only the entries of past visitors and disputes, but the margins, the faint pencil annotations that had seemed insignificant at first glance. One remark, almost smudged beyond recognition, caught his attention, a cryptic set of initials accompanied by a small symbol, a mark that did not belong to any member of the household. Poirot's little grey cells stirred. The ledger had been at the centre of the recent chaos, yet here, hidden in plain sight, was a detail that had not factored into the unravelling of the mystery. The thought occurred to him that perhaps the recent events had been only a prelude, that a deeper layer of intrigue lingered beneath the surface, waiting for the careful observer to notice. He walked slowly to the window, the mist rolling in from the cliffs below, and allowed himself a faint smile. The day's resolution had been complete, yet the world of human behaviour was vast and unpredictable. Even the most meticulous orchestration, he knew, could leave threads dangling, secrets that, if pulled at the right moment, might reveal another hidden plot. The nephew had been clever, the housekeeper desperate, but the cryptic mark in the ledger suggested a player, or perhaps a shadowed influence, that had gone unnoticed entirely. It was a whisper of unfinished business, a small note that promised the possibility of a future enigma. Poirot's gaze drifted across the library, noting once more the arrangement of objects, the faint scuff marks, the placement of the books, and the lingering presence of the White Knight. Everything in the castle seemed calm, yet he knew better than to trust appearances completely. The subtle imbalance, the almost imperceptible irregularity, reminded him that human ingenuity could always conceal further mysteries. Even in victory, the detective understood, the world remained a landscape of hidden motives and untold secrets, waiting for the observant mind to discern them. He gently closed the ledger and placed it on the shelf, the cryptic mark lingering in his memory. "Mes amis," he murmured softly to the empty room. "We have seen the unraveling of deception and the unveiling of truth, yet one must always expect the unexpected. For the mind that plots, the hand that deceives, is rarely satisfied with a single act. Even now, beyond the horizon of our knowledge, another thread waits, subtle, cunning, and ready to reveal itself." The detective moved toward the grand entrance hall, the faint echo of his steps blending with the distant patter of rain against stone. Outside, the castle seemed to exhale with the settling storm, the mist curling like secrets in the air. Poirot paused at the doorway, taking one last contemplative glance at the household behind him, at the faces of those who had been caught in the web of intrigue. The resolution was real, the villains exposed, yet the lingering question, the tiny overlooked detail, the cryptic initials, remained in his mind like a shadow at the edge of vision. As he stepped into the chill evening, the wind tugging gently at his coat, Poirot felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. A case had ended, yes, but mysteries, he knew, were never truly finished. Somewhere, just beyond sight, another puzzle waited, subtle and intricate, ready to test the limits of his observation and deduction once more. With measured steps and calm confidence, he walked away from the castle, the fog curling around his figure, leaving behind both resolution and the unspoken promise of enigmas yet to come.